afternoon session. I'm chairing, and as before, the speakers have 30 minutes to speak, and then 15 minutes for questions. You can, as people have done, glide into the question phase, but I'll be reading this at 25 minutes, and the first speaker is Leon.
Okay, so don't count this as part of my time, but this is a slide. This is a picture I just got in WhatsApp, showing a toddler watching the YouTube channel with Orly's talk. Yeah, it's one of our colleagues who couldn't come because her daughter is sick, so she was watching the. Okay, so anyhow. Okay, so this is not the way I plan to start this, but nevertheless, what I'm going to try to tell you later is that these red dots is what we call consciousness. Okay, so now, huh? You want to come? I thought you want to box me. Okay, affordances, right? Okay, so we'll start with the beginning. So conscious experience is a remarkable phenomena for a lot of us, and as we all know, remarkable phenomena require remarkable explanations. Okay, and therefore, there has been a line of suggestions that to have conscious experience, we need some kind of a magic or a secret ingredient. And I'm showing here a direct quote from Victor, who is not here. I'm competing now with Yuri Buzaki on the other side of campus, which is not fair. But it's
I guarantee you're winning.
Okay. So people are looking for the missing ingredient that will make the difference between being consciously aware or to experience and not experiencing. Or in the same paper, he actually asks specifically, where does the magic happen? So they're looking for some kind of a magic or a secret ingredient that will make the difference. And then there were a series of papers in the last decade, which just ended, urging us to look for what has been called in different papers the true NCC, or the NCC proper, or the NCC substrate, or constitutive NCC, or causal NCC, all pointing to the idea that we should look for something very, very specific which constitutes consciousness. And specifically, Dominique has already shown this slide from a really beautiful study by Lucia and her colleagues, where they said that they argued that we should actually not look for general NCC, but we should separate it into prerequisites for NCC, which are not the NCC itself, and consequences which come after once we are aware, but are not the NCC itself. And we should concentrate rather on this NCC, they call it the NCC proper. And another study in the same year called it the
What's NCC?
Neural correlate of consciousness, sorry. Neural correlates of consciousness, yes. So that's another incarnation of the same argument, calling it the neural substrates, and again suggesting that we have the neural prerequisites, we have the neural consequences, but these are not the ones that we need to actually look into, but rather we should try to distill the neural correlates of consciousness proper. This can also be represented on a timeline. So for instance, this is from Claire Sargent and Deouell Nakash, showing a timeline where we have upstream things that happen, and then we have downstream things that happen. So these happen before on the timeline, before we actually have conscious experience, and what happens after conscious experience, it happens after. And then there's this very special moment in between in which we have consciousness, but prerequisites are no longer, and consequences have hardly started, and we should try to figure out what is this special thing that happens in this moment. And this is another timeline showing exactly the same thing from Howie and Bain. So it's kind of pervasive in the field to look for this very, very specific mechanism. In other words, what these arguments try to say is that we have a lot of things that are prerequisites for being aware, conscious. There are consequences, and our aim should be to try to eliminate one by one these prerequisites, and then try to eliminate by experimentation what should be called consequences, and eventually we are going to be left with the distilled or true NCC, okay, which will be the holy grail of what we're looking for. On the timeline, this actually says that we're going to try to take off the consequences and then try to eliminate the prerequisites. Oops, I thought maybe there should be something new. Okay, so is the dot, right? Which is the dot, right? The dot, exactly. Okay, so this is at least the picture that these papers have portrayed in the field, and they went steps further to try to say, okay, what would be the sign, the signature of this true NCC? How would we know that we found a true NCC? So across these papers, these are the criteria. The first one is that this mechanism or process should invariably correlate with having an experience, okay, being aware of something that happened. So whenever awareness change, this thing should change as well, okay, invariably in all experiments. And Aru et al., this is Lucia's paper, say specifically that neuronal activity which does not meet that, which changes in one experiment but does not correlate with awareness on another, should be delegated to the prerequisite stand. Okay, so that's one thing. Another one could be that tinkering with this putative mechanism, either shutting it down or stimulating it, should accordingly do the same thing to our conscious experience. It should be, if you think about the timeline, it should be not too late, and it shouldn't be too early, because too early is the prerequisite, too late is the consequences, so it would be somewhere in the middle. It should, in the most extreme position, it should actually elicit or create conscious awareness even when in isolation, without the prerequisites and without the consequences. And another argument would be that it matches with some sound biological theoretical framework that will explain perhaps why this is what we call consciousness. Okay, so there have been several criteria, and using these criteria, or general looking for the NCC, there's been many suggestions or what could be the neural correlate of consciousness. This could be in space. So this is a list of places in the brain which have been associated with the NCC. It basically covers a big part of the brain. Okay, so it basically covers a big part of the brain. If you look in time, using mainly event-related potentials, then different electrophysiological phenomena have been associated using usually the contrastive paradigm, meaning contrasting situations in which we are aware and situations in which we are not, and then put the emphasis on either pre-stimulus activity, which determines whether we will be or will not be aware of what we are seeing, and then the P1, the P2, the visual awareness negativity, which is elicited around here, and then a lot of it is said about the P3. So all across this timeline, we have candidates for the NCC, and if we move from space and time to specific processes, we have a whole list of that as well, starting a long time ago by the idea of integration by 40 Hertz oscillations, and some about NMDA receptor-mediated processes, the global neuronal workspace activation, recurrent activity by Victor, complexity from Tononi, and information integration again from Tononi. So there's been a list of processes as well. The problem is that each one of these over time has been refuted based on these criteria that I just showed before. So there's always a counter-argument for each one of these, and I want to just give two examples to the first criterion of being invariably correlated with consciousness. So this is a paper by Rafi Malach's group from a few years ago, in which they showed object or faces masked with backward masking to the degrees that about half of the pictures were seen and half of the pictures were not seen. So the very same stimulus, a very important criterion in our field. We don't vary the stimulus, but the perceptual awareness varies from one trial to the other. And then when they sorted the trials to those in which the subject, using ECOG with patients, intracranial recordings, the subject sometimes sees and sometimes doesn't see the object. When the subject sees the object, where the face, here the face is, you have this big flurry or ignition of high frequency broadband activity, perhaps a correlate of population firing, which Rafi called this a local ignition. And then if the patient is not seeing in another trial the face, there's very little of this ignition. Okay, so the local ignition was suggested as the correlate of conscious awareness, or even this to substantiate or conscious awareness. And in good days, Rafi would even say that even if he puts it in the Petri dish, right, it would still be aware, right? Okay, so that just to take it to the extreme, just for the case of the argument. And then not long time afterwards, Lucia tried another way to look at the neural correlate of consciousness, and what they did is to present subjects with noisy images. Sometimes there were figures embedded in these images, and sometimes not. And for some of these noisy images, the subject has seen before the clear image. So they have some prior knowledge of this picture before they see the noisy image. Okay, and then it turns out that this prior knowledge helps the subject. This is the difference between the blue and the red here. So if you have seen the picture before, you can detect the faint figure in the image better than if you haven't seen this figure before. So that's one thing. And another thing that they did was to manipulate the level of noise, how much noise was in the image. Okay, and you see that too actually changes your ability to perceive the image in this noisy thing. So that is behaviorally. Now again, with the same ECOG data in patients, okay, they look at the very kind of the same area that Rafi was looking at, the face-sensitive area in the diffuse ring gyrus, and they get this same ignition. But now if they compare the effect of noise in the image on this ignition, there is definitely an effect. So there's a bigger ignition when there is less noise. Okay? But when they look at the effect of prior exposure, which affected behavior considerably, there is no effect on the ignition. Okay? So now this kind of refutes this ignition as the proper NCC, because it does not invariably change with awareness. And another problem with this idea comes from a study that we did, again with patients with intracranial electrodes. We presented stimuli with 5 different durations from 300 to 1500 milliseconds. And if you look at an electrode in V1, you see that the electrode actually responds for as long as the stimulus is on. So these are sorted trials, 300 millisecond stimuli, 600, and so on and so forth. You can see that trial by trial, each line here is a trial. Trial by trial, there is an increase in this high frequency gamma activity. But if you go to an electrode in the FFA, the same electrode where Rafi sees the ignition, there is a big flurry of activity at the onset of the stimulus, but then later on, even though imagine looking at the picture for a second and a half, you continue to see it throughout the second and a half. There is no difference. Okay, you still see it, but nevertheless, the high gamma activity dies out to a very low level, to the point that about a second into the stimulus, you can't tell whether the stimulus has already ended or not from looking at single trials in the data. Okay. So this also doesn't fit the idea of ignitions being the correlate of conscious perception. Okay. Then there is the question of the global neuronal network, the frontoparietal activity, and the P3. It's possible correlate, which have been criticized or challenged by finding that the activity in frontoparietal areas is diminished if you don't ask the subject to actually report whether they actually are seeing or not seeing. And the P3, again, shows this effect of a big response when you detect the targets versus when you do not detect the target. But if the same stimulus, which is visible or invisible but is not task-related, then there is no P3 effect. Okay? And there's been a very new study just came out a few days ago replicating this in a different way, but from Mike Pitt's lab. So in different conditions, different NCCs come about. So So the first problem with this idea of a pure proper NCC is that practically there is not one candidate that has so to date met the criteria that were suggested. Okay. It also gives a high power to null results, because every null result actually refutes a possible candidate. And it also smacks a little bit of Cartesianism, right? So it's like everything has to come into some center where if it changes, consciousness changes or not. But that doesn't have to be a part of this. But it might hint to this kind of a Cartesian view. More than that, I argued before, and I don't have time to go into the details now, but in fact there is no a priori consideration that would tell us whether a candidate NCC is really the proper NCC, or whether it is a prerequisite or a consequence. So consider, for instance, I did have an optogenetic mechanism that I could use safely in humans, and I could turn on and off a specific candidate to being the proper NCC. And I was lucky, and I actually am able to shut down consciousness and turn it on again. Somebody would come and say, you just turned on and off a necessary prerequisite, but which is not sufficient to actually create the conscious awareness. And same thing for the consequence, if it's an automatic, obligatory consequence. Okay. So I was just saying that to recognize a pure NCC, you actually have to know in advance what is the signature of a pure NCC, and that is a little bit circular. Okay. So what I actually want to say from now on is to try to argue that what we actually may need to do is not to get rid of the prerequisites and the consequences, but actually to get rid of the center part of the pure NCC and think about the whole gamut of different parameters as what actually constitutes consciousness. And so it goes this way. I'll start with some I think non-controversial premises about what we are doing. So the first is that what we're trying to actually explain is subjective experience, the fact that we have a subjective experience. The other premise is that a lot of what happens in our brain, in our cognitive system, in our mental system, goes on without conscious experience. Okay? And that we are able usually to tell the difference between being consciously aware, having an experience, and not having an experience, although I'm not arguing that this is infallible. I'm not arguing that whatever I say about my experience is my experience, but we usually are able to tell the difference, otherwise we wouldn't be able to do the research that we're doing. Okay? And the last one is that the only direct access to my experience is mine. Okay, I only have direct access to my conscious experience. Otherwise, it's always mediated by asking the question. And in fact, even in myself, it is mediated by asking the question. So the point is that there is the question. Okay, so I ask, did I see the gorilla, or did you see the gorilla? Okay, did you just see a word flashed on the screen when I switched the slide? Did you see a word flash? There was no word flashing. Okay. Just before you were playing with the sounds, and you asked, did you hear the neurons ticking? And I had to ask myself, did I hear the neurons ticking, or didn't I hear the neurons ticking? So I asked myself the question, okay, did you see it? Did you experience? In other words, did you have an experience? Okay, and how would I know? How do I know how to answer the question? Like everything, I have to make a decision, and I have to make a decision means that I have to I'm looking for evidence. Okay, I'm looking for evidence that I actually had an experience. Now the question is, what would be the evidence? And in my view, understanding what would be the evidence is critical for understanding how conscious experience unfolds in our mind or brain. And I'm suggesting that this evidence is nothing supranormal, not quantum physics or something that pervades the universe, but probably, although this is open, probably the same kind of mechanisms that we were thinking before as prerequisites and consequences of conscious experience. So I listed just a random list of the arousal level, the level of activity in early sensory cortices, whether there is persistence of activity, whether some verbal material popped out because of what I saw, whether I have the emotional response that I would expect when I see something or when I hear something, whether there's a spatial tag, where there's a temporal context, whether there's a memory trace that was suddenly activated for some reason, which is related to what I was supposed to be seeing or not seeing. So all these are pieces of evidence that I could collect in order to figure out whether I'm conscious or not. So this is where it comes to these red dots. Okay, so you can think of all these parameters as a multi-dimensional space. Okay, where each of these axes is one of these parameters. Of course, I can't draw anything more than 3D, so we'll resort to 2D. Okay, so if I take any two of these parameters, I can draw the state of my system. So my system goes and figures out, am I experiencing? Am I not experiencing? Have I experienced the gorilla just a second ago? So it finds, when the question is asked, the system finds itself in one of these positions in this two-dimensional graph, but in fact in a multi-dimensional graph. Okay, and these are just some of the possible parameters. And now what needs to be done is to put some difference, some threshold between what I would eventually call being experiencing and not experiencing. Okay, and so I've put this arbitrary threshold between the blue dots and the yellow orange dots, and now I can be in some situation in this position where I have a lot of sensory activation, a lot of ignition in high order visual cortex, and I don't really have so much activation of a memory trace of this particular stimulus. Okay, but another point in time, I might be in this position where I have a memory trace activated, so with much less of activity in sensory cortex, I would still say I am conscious, because these dots is what I call consciousness. Okay, these dots I call unconscious. Now you notice here that I put the threshold here so that there will be some places where even if I have a very, very strong memory trace and there is nothing in sensory cortex, completely zero, then I would still say I didn't see anything. Okay, so what exactly is the shape of this border? I have no idea, but this is what it would be. Now, if you think of my examples of Rafi's and Lucia's paper before, this would explain what is actually going on. So in Rafi's experiment, they were manipulating the sensory evidence, okay, by this masking, or actually by the fluctuation of sensory evidence by this masking, and so they were moving from this point to that point. Okay. On the other hand, in Lucia's study, they were actually moving the system from this point to this point without changing anything in the sensory evidence. Okay, it's just that here we don't have a memory trace to activate, and here we have a memory trace to activate. So it brings us from this region to that region. Just to make the point that there is something interesting about understanding these parameters. I drew here this parameter of ignition as if it's gradual and continuous, but an ignition is something which is kind of a bursting or exploding, right? So that's not a problem. We can just say, okay, this is the way it actually is, right? So we can either be in this place or in this place, and this part of space is empty because it never happens that you are in this space. But the explanation would be the same explanation. Now, in fact, thinking about that, I realized that this can also explain the issue of adaptation in our study, because what if once the subject has seen the picture of a face or an object for 300 milliseconds, it's enough to create a memory trace of some sort of this image. So from now on, for the rest of the time the stimulus is presented, I don't need to be in this high state of ignition to still say I'm seeing it. I can be in this point in space. So we might actually be moving in time from this point to that point along the 1.5 second of viewing the image, which will explain why I still call this an experience. Okay, it's enough to be an experience. Now, an important point that I want to make, which I think will resonate with Mike's talk later on, and I think it's a difference, I think, from Mike's position, is that although I talked a lot about this decision about whether I was conscious or not conscious, I'm not arguing that the decision is being conscious. So there are two things. There is the being conscious or not conscious, or being not conscious, having an experience or not having an experience, and then a decision about that experience. Okay, the decision about that experience is important in understanding the experience, but it's not the experience itself. And I'm saying this because it's important for me to point out that we don't need to report, even to ourselves. We don't need to answer the question to ourselves of whether I'm seeing something or not seeing it, because as long as I am in this part of space which is red here, even if I'm not at the moment, asking myself, I am in this point of space, in the parameter space, and so this is what we call being conscious. Okay, so that's actually a nice, I think, benefit of this position, that it allows us to have ongoing, continuous experience, even in times of no big change, when nobody probes us, we don't probe ourselves, we are immersed in this very beautiful movie or a natural scene or reading a book and so on. But if somebody asked us, we would say, yes, we were conscious, right? Although nobody, and not even ourselves, stopped us to ask the question, okay? But it's not surprising. We simply were in the right position in space, okay? So these are the benefits for me from thinking about the problem in this way. So from looking at it from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, I think of other functions that we are trying to explain. They are always multi-componential and multidimensional, and it's easier, I think, it makes sense to think of this very, very complex high-order function that we call experiencing in the same kind of framework, and not try to say that this particular function has one beautiful, elegant mechanism that will explain it, whereas other functions we can do with a lot of patchwork of different modules and functions and so on. I already said it separates the introspection or decision from the state of having experience. It allows, if you will, to have experiences which are different in their flavor, but yet is experienced as an experience. Because if we are in different points of space within this red region of my graph, you have different conscious experiences, but all of them have this kind of prototype. Thanks, Ron, for giving me this terminology. This prototype similarity of conscious experiences. Something that Orly said a couple of years ago to me made me think that perhaps it's also a spell against zombies, because if you think of having a subjective experience as nothing but being in this state of regular mental, cognitive, emotional functions, then you must have, once you have all these regular mental functions, you will be conscious. So you cannot have one without the other. It's just that's what it is. And I want to finish with saying that I don't think this is in any way a pessimistic view of the field. I know I was not trying to say that everything is refuted so we can't find anything. Rather, this is, I think, a nice way of trying to explore the field, because it opens up interesting questions about this parameter field. So first, which factors actually count in this? Not every parameter in the brain or in the cognitive system or emotional system should count for experiencing. There should be some that do and some that don't. And maybe some are weighted higher and some are weighted less. And this is something that we can explore. Importantly, it's not by introspection. It's not that I'm suggesting that I'm asking myself whether I'm experiencing, and by introspection I will figure out all these parameters. These will be open for manipulations, just as we usually do. We manipulate these parameters and we'll see whether they affect my eventual judgment of whether I experienced or not. We can ask whether which of the different parameters actually affect the conscious experience of neuropsychological patients, like agnostic patients or like neglect patients. And then something that I, for instance, suggested in my PhD, that in neglect is particularly missing the spatial tag from these dimensions, or putting you in some place on the spatialness axis, which renders you unconscious, just pushes you to this part of space where you're unconscious. I already talked about the distribution of parameters being like linear or not linear, and we also can ask how does the actual question affect what we think about our experience? So we usually think, for instance, about experiences as all or none. We either experience or we don't experience. And for instance, I remember from Stan's papers from the early 2000s, very nice results with distributions where patients either say this or say that. They almost never say something in the middle, right? So the question is whether this is a factor, an outcome of the point where I need to make a decision, right? So then I have to make the decision when it's black or white. But in fact, perhaps before I ask the question, it's more graded in this way or maybe in that way. Okay? I'm not sure exactly how you would go about figuring out whether the experience is really gradual or all or none. But I'm just saying that it's very possible that it's actually the question, the retrospective question, which makes it look like it's all or none. Okay, I think that I laid my argument. I really love this cartoon. And I want to finish by thanking especially the members of the Deconstructing and Reconstructing consciousness, which has been tremendously effective for me for clarifying some of the points of this thing that I spoke about before, but not in this detail. And I want to, not sure who, I think Liad said there was nothing was written about, nothing useful was written, nothing worth reading. But so for me, if there's something worth reading, it's this book, okay, which I think is important and inspiring, and I urge everybody to read this. It's a book from the 50s. Okay, thank you.
We have time for questions. You want to decide who to invite?
Yeah, not Rafi. I'll let you speak.
Leon, thanks for the great talk. So as the example of multidimensionality that you're suggesting, you talked about perceptual excitation and memory. But aren't those really the same thing? Because you're talking about either activation as a result of incoming physical stimuli or sustained activation from a slightly previous stimuli. What else could there be?
Oh, there could be a lot of things. I mean, you can have activation without having a memory trace, right? And you can have a memory trace without having an activation. So these are two different entities that could be interactive, and they might be interactive, but there are two different things. You can have activation of the FFA without ever seeing that face, okay? But if you actually know that face because you have a memory trace of it in your hippocampus, for example, that would be activated as well, right? It might then boost the activation in the sensory areas, but it's two different things. That's not necessarily the same thing.
But isn't there a final common pathway of?
That I'm not sure. I'm not sure that we should look for final common pathway because that's what I call Cartesian. We don't want to think. It might be the fact that eventually Descartes was right. I mean, but I prefer not to think this way. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. What I'm not, maybe that's a follow-up on the zombie issue you mentioned. So it seems like you put a lot of weight on the subjective experience. So how would you?
All of the weight.
Okay, so let's say you build a very sophisticated robot. How would you know? How would you test whether it is conscious or not?
That's a great question, and it definitely related to this framework. So I would say if we were like at the end of the road and I knew what the parameter space is that I call conscious experience, then if I could measure the same parameters in my robot or program it to have these this place in the parameter space, I would be obliged to say that this robot has an experience. I would have no reason at least to think that it's not, because this is what I call having an experience. Okay. Now, if we're not at the end of the road, then I have a different answer for how would I know. I think most of it is based on superficial resemblance between behaviors, but maybe this is not related to that talk.
So this might be not the right question given your title, but I find it very hard to not ask what's different between one side of the line and another. Why this side of the parameter space, this area of the parameter space, leads to experience and the other one doesn't.
Perfect. Somebody had to ask this question, right? And I tried not to let Rafi ask, and now you. So there's always the question of why. Okay, why having 40 hertz oscillation would make you conscious? Why having global neural workspace working give you oscillation? Why high integration information would give you conscious awareness? And that's always the question that is kind of people hand wave in trying to explain, because it has the problem of having in like you a priori decide what it should look like and then look for something like that in the brain, and so within your conceptualization of what it should look like, you find something which matches, which is fine, but it's very close within your hypothesis. So it's a hard question to answer, but if you push me, I would say that the question is, how do we learn that this is what we should call conscious experience? Okay, so this is just hardly cooked thoughts. Okay, but I started thinking about it, and my only hypothesis is that while we grow up, while we develop, right, we learn from experience, from our parents and from the social network around us, what it is that we call conscious experience. Okay, because think about it. Think about the question of have you seen something, and I ask you the question and you say yes. Okay, and then I would say so what was it like? Okay, and so you realize that it has to be something which is like when you say yes, I've seen something. And so what did it do to you? Did it elicit some experience, some emotion in you? So this when you say experience, you mean that it has some emotional valence to it. Okay, so tell me where it was then. It has to have a spatial tag to it, right? And so on and so forth. I mean, I'm hand waving because I don't know exactly what the real parameter space is, but this is the way in which we would learn what part of the space is what we call conscious experience.
One of the factors that you put into your kind of list of parameters was verbal report.
Mm-hmm.
Now, verbal report is something that we have. It's very important for our consciousness. It's not very important for the consciousness of a dog.
Mm-hmm.
And but nevertheless, we sort of have there is fairly wide consensus that there is something like subjective experiencing of a dog, that it actually feels pain and pleasure. So the question is not whether or not a verbal report is important for our consciousness, because obviously it is. But what happens? But do you really need it as part of your in your parameter space? And what happens during evolution? So it could be the case, for example, that when we develop language and verbal report, the relative importance of other parameters in your list is smaller, gets smaller, because this already does some of the. This is sort of changing the landscape of consciousness and things like that. So the question is, what actually do you think are the minimal kind of parameters that you would put into your space? Those parameters that would allow us also to follow the evolution of consciousness, because I think that there is a general consensus in this room that it has probably evolved.
Yeah. So that's the question for research. I think the research should actually ask what are the parameters, but always realizing that it would be a complex set of parameters, some with higher weight and some with lesser weight. I take your point, which is I think really interesting, is that if along evolution some parameters are introduced which were not there before, for instance language, then they might actually demote some other parameters to have lesser weight in the space. So the shape of the space actually changes over time. That's an interesting thought. I don't know exactly how to think about other creatures other than humans, to say whether it's a different type of experience or not the same type of experience. I simply have no tools to say that, but I think the point is really interesting about the reshaping of the space. Think about neglect patients, for example, who have a lesion in their parietal cortex. I mean, it's a common saying among neurologists that that the shape of their experience actually changes. So it's a kind of a way of saying it, but maybe there is some truth to it, that you actually change the parameter space rather than the space itself outside. We have time for Rafi? I'm just saying that because we have been arguing for 5 months.
Your call. You tell me who to give
No, please, no, Rafi, it's you. You have the final
A
question.
great talk, first of all. One question is related to this line that you said. And I didn't see in any claim that you made in this talk an argument against the possibility that the line is defined by some common principle, some dynamic or something that we simply did not discover yet. I completely agree that the activity, the adaptation is very interesting, powerful argument against just activity, just, high level. But maybe synaptic effect or something will explain the line. Right now you're giving it to us as a list, and we should sort of buy it because, all these, but the beauty of science is to try to find a common principle that will explain the line. That's the question is whether you have an argument against that.
So I don't need that. I don't have a strong argument against the possibility that eventually there will be some Darwinian principle, natural selection, that will explain why the line, this plane actually, this multidimensional plane has the shape it has. For the reasons that I explained, it seems to me that if I have to put my bets on whether we will find such a principle that will explain exactly the shape of this, or if we will have to settle for the fact that this is the shape of the plane, and it's learned by society. Maybe somebody will find that it's different in different societies, and so on. I would bet on the second. I don't have a principle. I have some arguments that I didn't have time to go into, suggesting that I don't think we will have the tools to tell that this is the mechanism, even if there is one. But how do I know? Many people have said that things will not happen, and they happen. So, yeah. Thanks.
Our next speaker is John Morrison from Columbia University.
Automated. Okay.
You're a bit more specific. What is the boundary?
It is a restatement of the it's a restatement of the problem, exactly. But I agree, it's a restatement of the problem. I'm just saying that. Sorry.
We can hear your
Oh my goodness! All over the
Over the YouTube.
Is there a way?
That's happened.
Is there a way to delete?
John, do you want to take this meanwhile?
Sure.
Yeah, this problem.
I don't want them mirrored. I want them.
The mirror. Okay.
Change the settings. here.
Yeah. Okay. Afternoon, everybody.
All right, we're starting.
Thanks for your patience. I'd like to suggest a new view about the role of consciousness in perceptual decisions. According to this view, consciousness itself can be uncertain in that it can include representations of competing possibilities, each of which is weighted by a degree of uncertainty. To better understand this view and its rivals, let's consider a very simple task. In this task, subjects are asked whether a grading is oriented leftward or rightward. Most subjects have no trouble categorizing this grading as leftward. Some gradients are harder to categorize. This gradient is harder to categorize because its orientation is closer to 90 degrees. This grading is harder to categorize because its contrast is so low. A natural explanation for why this grading is harder to categorize is that our measurements of its orientation are more likely to be further away from its actual orientation. In other words, our measurements are less reliable. When our measurements are less reliable, it can be useful to rely on information about the orientations of past gradings. For example, if most of our gradings were oriented rightward, we might use that information to bias our decision about the current grading. We would then be using our information about past gradings as a kind of prior. The extent to which our decisions about the current grading should be biased toward our prior depends on the reliability of our measurement. For example, if the contrast is high and our measurement is therefore more reliable, our decision shouldn't be as biased toward our prior. Some human and non-human subjects are near optimal in the sense, on these kinds of tasks, in the sense that the extent to which they rely on the prior depends on the reliability of their measurement. Some even seem able to learn the correct reliability of their measurements and the correct prior. To many, this seems like compelling evidence that these subjects are relying on representations of uncertainty. In particular, that they are relying on a representation of the reliability of their measurement, which involves an element of uncertainty, and a representation of a prior, which also involves an element of uncertainty. Both representations seem to play an important role in perceptual decisions. This leads to an important but rarely discussed question, namely, what is the relation between these representations and consciousness? That is, what is the relation between the subject's uncertainty and consciousness? There are at least 4 views, so let's consider them one by one, continuing to focus on this particular task. According to the first view, uncertainty precedes consciousness. There's a couple of versions of this. Let's start with the simplest version. The simplest version is that there are representations of uncertainty in pre-conscious processes that together are combined to produce a point estimate of the grading's orientation. That point estimate is then promoted into consciousness when it is then broadcast to the post-conscious processes that are responsible for the decision about whether the grading is oriented leftward or rightward. A more sophisticated version of this view would have it that those earlier representations of uncertainty about reliability and the prior give rise to a distribution of uncertainty over possible orientations. And one particular orientation is then selected from that distribution, maybe the one assigned the least uncertainty, which is then promoted into consciousness and broadcast to the processes responsible for making the ultimate decision. There are also versions of this view where instead of producing point estimates, instead what's produced are ranges of values. Say, for example, the range of values within one standard deviation of the mean of whatever uncertainties are represented in the pre-conscious processes. In any case, on this first view, the role of consciousness is to broadcast an estimate that results from pre-conscious representations of uncertainty. At least from an engineering point of view, one disadvantage of this arrangement is that uncertainty is then not accessible by later processes, even though that uncertainty might be useful. For example, it might be useful when a subject is trying to decide how to respond to asymmetrical rewards. The second view, the uncertainty follows consciousness and instead of preceding it. There are again several variants. One view is that pre-conscious processes, just maybe through some lookup table or some more complicated version of a lookup table, give rise to a point estimate that is then promoted into consciousness and then broadcast to later processes. These later processes then use that point estimate to generate a representation of uncertainty. For example, if it's a low contrast grading, these later processes might rely on a background belief like if the grading has a low contrast, then I should not be not assign a lot of certainty to whatever point estimate arises through consciousness. As before, you can also have versions of this view which use ranges instead of point values. Perhaps the most sophisticated version of this view uses this sequential point estimates or ranges to produce the distribution. In a way, uses them. If it's 80 degrees, 81, 79, 80, eventually from all of those different samples, all those different point estimates, you could reconstruct an uncertainty. In any case, the role of consciousness on this kind of view is to broadcast an initial point estimate or range to the processes that then generate representations of uncertainty. From an engineering point of view, this again has some disadvantages. In particular, a disadvantage of this arrangement is there's a loss of information from the early processes that might have been useful when trying to come up with the correct assignment of uncertainty at the post-conscious level. For example, the spread of activity over the detectors of orientation detectors is very useful information when trying to figure out how reliable one's measurements are, and therefore how much certainty one should have in the relevant point estimate. So in that sense, there's a disadvantage. A third view, which you saw coming, is that you could have representations of uncertainty both pre-conscious and post-conscious. The earlier representation of uncertainty might give rise to a point estimate or range, and later processes do their best to generate another representation of uncertainty, perhaps using background beliefs about contrast or other variables. Another version of this would be you could take samples from this earlier distribution and then use those samples sequentially over time to rebuild something like what your uncertainty should be. Of course, from an engineering point, a natural problem with that approach is that only at the limit of infinite time will these be guaranteed to be identical, and there's room for lots of error from the random samples that are taken. The random samples might not ultimately produce an uncertainty representation that matches the one that preceded consciousness. There is also a version of this which is not properly depicted here, which is that you could think about there being two channels that leading to the post-conscious processes. One goes through consciousness that gives you just, say, a point estimate, and another that gives probabilistic representation through a different channel up to those processes. So consciousness would give you some kind of non-probabilistic snapshot of the world, and the probabilistic representations would make their way into decision-making through other channels. We would then be, all of us would then be something like you might call probabilistic blindsiders, in the sense that there would be information about the stimulus, probabilistic information, that makes its way into decision-making, but then not through the channel of consciousness. You might even then worry that on this kind of view, consciousness becomes epiphenomenal in the decision. Some people might not regard that as a disadvantage, but it strikes me as one that's at least at odds with the introspective evidence. In any case, the role of consciousness on this third kind of view is to broadcast an earlier estimate that generates representations of uncertainty. Now, before I go on to the fourth view, keep in mind that the three views I just mentioned are not supposed to be universally true or universally false. One might be true for a given task in a given subject, another might be true for a different task in a different subject. Okay, so the fourth view is the one that I would like to suggest. On this view, consciousness itself is uncertain, in that it can include a representation of competing possibilities, each weighted by a degree of uncertainty. Note that the uncertainties, as it moves through this stream of information, needn't be identical to each other, and they could be modified as, say, later information comes into play. But nonetheless, uncertainty propagates from the earlier pre-conscious processes through the post-conscious process and goes through, in particular, through consciousness itself. One of the reasons why, from an engineering point of view, that this is potentially advantageous is that you might end up making better decisions because you don't lose important information earlier that goes into generating these representations of uncertainty, and therefore you might end up with a better representation of uncertainty that comes later. As far as I can tell, I'm the first to develop and endorse this view. For the most part, neuroscientists and psychologists just avoid the question altogether because outside of this room, most aren't willing to make claims about consciousness, including its role in decision-making. When it is discussed, it seems, as far as I can tell, it is always quickly dismissed. So one of the few psychologists to talk about it is Larry Maloney. And Larry is a vision scientist at NYU. After noting that it would be beneficial to decision making if this was indeed the way the mind was arranged, he quickly dismisses it. He asks a question. It's not right. What does it mean to perceive a distribution rather than a point estimate? And without further elaboration, sets this view aside, seemingly think that there's just no good way of making sense of the view that conscious perception itself could be uncertain in the sense that I've described. Richard Holton, in a criticism of predictive coding, writes as follows. He says, at the level of what we see rather than of what our unconscious visual systems are doing, we don't have a graded continuum of confidence in different hypotheses. Perceptions are all or nothing. And in response to Clark and to my own work, Holton and my own work, Andy Clark has written, our perceptual worlds display unity and coherence and depict a single way things are. So there's a lot of skepticism about this fourth view. It seems to many people to be incoherent, or they're unable to make good sense of it. I think it's also worth noting that none of these argument authors really give anything like an argument for their view. They just seem to find the view on conscious uncertainty to be prima facie absurd. I find that when confronted with skeptics like this, the best way to proceed is through a consideration of examples. And I find, not with all skeptics, but some skeptics can really get to see that there's more to the view than they might have initially thought. So suppose you see a figure walking towards you in the distance. When the figure gets close enough, you might report, that looks like it might be my friend Isaac, so a friend from college. And when the figure gets closer, you might report, that's probably my friend Isaac. And when the figure's right in front of you, you might say, here's Isaac. So all of these reports reflect what you believe, your increasing belief that it is Isaac. But these reports also seem to capture something about the experience itself. Recognition is not all or nothing. Sometimes it seems like we recognize someone in a way that it seems like it might be them, but even our visual system, our perceptual experience, our consciousness is not yet sure that it's them. And that's something that can come in degrees. Or suppose you're walking down a trail that you believe to be marked entirely by red trail markers. In the distance, you see a trail marker, and you might say to yourself, that looks as though it could be an orange trail marker. And you get closer, and it looks as though it's probably an orange. And you get right in front of you, oh no, it's an orange one, I'm on the wrong trail. Once again, these reports unquestionably reflect what's going on at the level of what you believe. But I think they also, if you sort of vividly imagine these kinds of cases, they also capture something about your conscious perception itself. That once again, we don't just consciously perceive the colors of things. Sometimes things seem to more likely have some colors than other colors. Another cause of conscious uncertainty is intensity. Suppose you're in a perfectly dark room and an experimenter tells you that at some point she's going to turn on a very dim light and slowly increase its intensity. At first you might report, the room is completely dark. And then at some point you might say something like, it looks as though there could be a light on. And as the intensity increases, you might say, it looks as though there's probably a light on. It looks as though the light's on. Once again, the lights don't just look to be on or off. The level of consciousness, sometimes it seems as though a light could be on, although there isn't certainty. Another example, consider just things in the periphery. You hold up a number of fingers, or you look at a grating in the periphery. It might look to you as though there are between, say, 2 and 5 fingers that are extended in your periphery, but and between those it might seem as though it's more likely there are 3, say, than 5. But again, it's not the case that there seem to be some determinate numbers of fingers or determinate numbers of bars when viewed in your periphery. It rather seems as though that some possibilities are more likely than other possibilities. Another cause of uncertainty, the level of perception, is blur. So suppose you wear glasses and you go to the optometrist, and the optometrist asks you, is that an E or an F? At first you might say, I can't tell, but slowly over time, as she improves your visual acuity through a series of lenses, you might start to say things like, it looks as though it's probably an F. It looks as though it's very likely an F. Okay, now it looks as though it's an F. Once again, these reports don't just reflect what's happening at the level of belief. I think they reflect what's happening at the level of perceptual consciousness. Figures don't just look to have one particular shape or another. Sometimes they look as though they have one shape more likely than a different shape. Suppose you're sitting in a car, and as the car suddenly makes a right turn, and they ask you to estimate what was the angle at which the car turned, you might say, it was somewhere between, say, 80 and 100 degrees. But then they turn the car continues, it turns again at the same angle, this time at a much slower speed. Now you might have a much more specific estimate. Now it feels more concrete that the car turned at a perpendicular angle rather than something that was wider or narrower. So when we move around in the world, we don't just always feel as though we're moving at some particular direction, at some particular orientation. Sometimes it feels as though we more likely moved at some orientation rather than a different orientation. Or suppose you're in a crowded party and you hear your friend's distinctive voice across the room, and you ask yourself, where's my friend coming from? Somewhere over by the kitchen. But as the crowd begins to thin out and fewer people are in the room, you might start to report more and more certainty about their exact location. What this shows is that where sounds seem to be coming from is not something definite. There's not a point or a range. It's sometimes the level of consciousness seems as though some locations are more likely than other locations, and we can adjust the distribution of that certainty over time. Okay, these are just a few of the causes of uncertainty, the level of consciousness. When the object is in the distance, when it's not intense, when it's peripheral, when it's blurred, speed and noise. It's also when the object is small, occluded, moving, changing, vibrating, or semi-transparent. When you are intoxicated, tired, distracted, surprised, confused, and inattentive. And one of the things that I think is helpful about considering so many examples is that when you just consider one example by itself, it might seem there's some other explanation for what's going on. But when you consider the number and the diversity of examples in which there seems to be uncertainty at the level of conscious perception, it starts to seem that there's something more unified going on in all these cases. The consciousness itself is not something that's either yes or no. It's something that can be graded in the sense that it presents us with possibilities, some of which seem more certain than others. So I've given, these examples by themselves are not arguments, so they're mostly just sort of warm-up acts. So in written, published work, I've given one argument, a first personal argument from introspection. I'm just going to quickly sketch what the argument looks like, and if you're interested more, we can talk about it, or you can find the paper on my website. And then I'll consider what a third personal empirical argument for the view might look like. So the first person argument asks what happens when you completely trust your conscious perception. So what is it to completely trust your conscious perception? Well, when you completely trust a doctor, plumber, or rabbi, you know what that is. You follow their advice. The rabbi example is not an audience pleaser. Okay. Likewise, when you completely trust a thermometer, a spectrometer, or a barometer, you just accept its measurement, whatever it says. Continuing this pattern, when you completely trust your conscious perception, you endorse the way that it presents objects. And completely trusting someone or something doesn't always result in complete certainty. If you completely trust your doctor and she's 40% certain that your leg is fractured, you'll end up with 40% certainty that your leg is fractured. Or if you completely trust your meteorologist, shouldn't, but if you completely trust your meteorologist and they say there's a 70% chance of rain tomorrow, then you'll end up believing there's a 70% rain tomorrow. So the thought is that when you completely trust something, you let it completely guide what your beliefs are going to be like. You mold your mind, your beliefs, around that source of information. And what I'm suggesting we can do is we can do the similar thing with our conscious perceptions. We can let it be the guide to what we should believe. Maybe we're not justified in ever doing this. Maybe it's hard to do, but it's something we can at least imagine. We can see what would happen if we just trusted our experience. And here's what I take to be a datum. Take the case of the figure that's approaching you from the distance. At some point when you completely trust your experience, you'll end up with 55% certainty that your particular friend Isaac. So what's the best explanation for that? Well, the simplest explanation is that when you completely trusted your conscious perception, and your conscious perception gave you the information, gave you the representation, that's Isaac. So, and then you just uptook that into your belief, and that's why you ended up having a 55% certainty at the level of deliberate belief about who it is. Whereas the other view is that, well, suppose you just represent that it's Isaac at that point. Then if you completely trusted your experience, you should end up with certainty that it's Isaac. Or if it failed to represent that it's Isaac, then you should end up with certainty that it's not Isaac. And so the argument here is that the best explanation for why we end up with this kind of mental state when we complete our conscious perception is that this uncertainty is in the conscious perception itself. There's a lot more possibilities to consider here. There's a lot more back and forth. But for now, I just want to give you a feel for the kind of introspective arguments that I think we can give for the view. One can also give a more empirical third-personal argument for the view. And the basic strategy is simple. What you want to do is find in the brain, before consciousness, a representation of uncertainty. And then you want to find, after consciousness, the same or similar representation of uncertainty. And then the argument to the best explanation is that the reason why these things match is that the same uncertainty was in the conscious perception itself. So it's like if I told Daphne a secret, and I see her whisper something to Mike, and Mike comes over and tells me my secret back to me, the best explanation is that Daphne just told Mike my secret. That's not guaranteed. Mike just might have been a really good guesser, or Daphne might have not told him directly, but given him some clues that let him reconstruct. But still, the simplest and best explanation of why Mike just told me the secret back is that Daphne told him. Similarly, if we can find the same representation of uncertainty after consciousness and driving the decision making that we found before consciousness, then the best explanation is that that uncertainty was preserved through consciousness, and that's why we ended up with the same kind of representations of uncertainty. But look, this kind of argument is really hard. So I have another paper where I go through what I consider the best empirical evidence for this, and it all comes up just a little bit short. But in a way that makes me hopeful that future empirical evidence is going to let us run an argument like this more successfully. I'm not going to go through those specific empirical studies now. I just want to point out some of the reasons why this is a difficult argument to give. One is that you need to make sure that you found a region in the brain that is preceding consciousness. And that's hard because we really have no idea where consciousness arises in the brain. Some people even think it arises in the visual cortex, making it very hard for us to find regions that are uncontroversially precede consciousness. But still, they seem like if you find something in the visual cortex, maybe even empty, then maybe you should have some confidence in the argument. Another thing that's really hard about this is we can test for these representations of uncertainty by manipulating, say, the rewards or other experimental variables. Another thing that's hard about identifying these representations of uncertainty is to make sure we've found a genuine representation of uncertainty rather than a representation of whatever evidence or data is later used to generate a representation of uncertainty. So in our toy task, that would be a representation of contrast that is later then used to generate a representation of uncertainty about the orientation of the stimulus. So in the same way, like you don't want to think that Sherlock Holmes comes into a room, maybe you can predict who he's going to say did it, but it's going to take him a long time to piece together the evidence to figure it out. So likewise, we want to make sure we're not just finding the representations of the evidence that later is what allows the brain to figure out what the uncertainty is. And that can be difficult. And I think really the only way to do that is to show that preceding consciousness we have the representations are involved in probabilistic inferences of the kind that suggest the brain is already treating these as representations of uncertainty and not as the other independent variables. We also need to make sure that the representations aren't going through an independent channel and are going through consciousness, that there's not another route to it. And that can be tricky, but I think can be done in part by looking to see if there's dissociations between the conscious representation and whatever would come through a different channel. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about arguments. Now I just want to give you a list of some implications. So in published work, I've talked about some implications that I think philosophers are likely to find interesting. And I'm not going to focus on those today. I'm going to try to talk about implications that neuroscientists and psychologists might find more interesting. Although that's ultimately up to you to tell me whether I've found something. So the first two are relatively obvious. One is about the nature of consciousnness. So many people think the nature of consciousness precludes the kind of uncertainty that I'm describing. Consciousness always gives us one scene at a time. It shows the one possibility for the world to be. It doesn't give us a range of possibilities and weight them by degrees of uncertainty. That, I think, was behind the skeptical claims by people like Clark and Maloney and guy's name. Another implication is something about the role of consciousness, in particular in decision making. So all of the other views I described give consciousness a different kind of role. It broadcasts the point estimate, which is later then used to generate a representation of uncertainty. Or it's supposed to be collapsing the probabilistic uncertainty representations that precede consciousness and just giving us one point estimate to be the basis of our action. The role of consciousness on the view I'm describing is quite different. Consciousness is not there to, in a way, interfere with the representations of uncertainty. Consciousness is just there to pass it along in a way that makes it available to many other systems for report or action. So consciousness is not interfering with decision making in the way that it is typically thought to. Another reason to be interested in this view is its implications for other domains. So that is its generalizations. So one might be a conscious action. So suppose you're sitting at a table and someone slides the salt shaker towards you. At some point it might seem to you as though you could possibly reach out and grab it. A second later it seems as though you could probably get it, and a second later it seems as though you can definitely get it. Or you're playing defense and there's against a soccer player, and it seems you're trying to poke it out. And at one point it seems as though maybe I could get it. A second later it seems I could probably get it. And then it may seem like I can stick this guy. All of these actions, it seems to us, that present themselves to us consciously are presented with degrees of uncertainty. So just like in perception, perceptual consciousness comes weighted with uncertainty, perhaps also action consciousness or behavioral consciousness, motor consciousness also comes weighted with uncertainties. Another possible implication, might interest some of you, has to do with memory. So for example, try to remember the color of the tablecloth that was on the table when you had breakfast this morning. Right? It might seem to you that there's only two options. Either you remember the color or you don't. And it might seem like there's only two options because it might seem like your memory of it is like an image. And an image either had some color in it in that location, or it has no color in it in that location. So just like pictures either have color at a location or don't, it might seem like memories have some bit of information or don't. The object was in my memory or it wasn't in my memory. The object had a certain color in my memory or it didn't have that color in my memory. It might seem like we just have these two options. But if conscious uncertainty is true, then it might extend to our memories as well. So it might be that my conscious episodic memory of, say, the tablecloth this morning was itself uncertain. It doesn't include a particular color, a range of colors for the tablecloth. It gives us some kind of sense of which colors are more likely than which other colors. And if this uncertainty view is true of perception, then it might also expect it to be true for memories, given that there's some evidence that in episodic memory, at least, some of the same brain systems are involved in both of them. Or maybe to give another example, suppose you're trying to decide between Cheerios and Fruit Loops or some other kind of cereal. On one view, what you do is you have memories of eating each of those cereals in the past, and they give you some kind of value. And that adds up to help you make this decision. But maybe when you call up these memories, it's not that they each give you some scalar value of how much pleasure you got out of them, how much value each of them had in it. Maybe there's some uncertainty attached to each of those memories. Maybe some memories where there's more certainty about the conscious certainty about the amount of pleasure it gives you will have a bigger role in decision making than as far as evaluating a certain option than other ones. It might even be that over time what happens is that memories don't fade in the sense that like details plop out of the memories. But maybe what happens is that memories become more uncertain over time, and to eventually some particular detail is just sort of flat across all possible shapes or colors or something like that. And maybe even one of the reasons why remembering and replay is so important in memory is that it helps us stop that process. So memories naturally are degrading in their certainties, and maybe what happens when we recall those memories is that we're helping to counteract that effect, to make them more certain, and therefore to make them more useful for future decision making. Okay, another reason, my implication of view that might be interesting is that it helps us draw a distinction between unconscious and uncertain. So if we're relying on reports to decide whether someone is conscious of a stimulus or not, it might be when they say that they're not conscious of it, what they really is going on is that they have very low certainty that there is a stimulus there, a very low certainty about the identity of that stimulus. So maybe in cases where we think a subject is unconscious, really they have just really low certainty about the stimulus. And that seems really plausible in cases when they're showed the stimulus for extraordinarily short durations, like in some of these masking experiments. So lots of measures that we have for deciding whether someone is conscious or not might be, in a way, confounding two different possibilities. The possibility that they're really genuinely unconscious of the stimulus, and the possibility that they have just extremely low certainty about it. And so they say they're not conscious. In a way, this is like, some people have talked about how these reporting paradigms aren't great because people might be just using criterions for reporting. And this is maybe a more sophisticated way of thinking about that. It's not just stimulus strength that's leading them to fail to report. It's uncertainty at the level of consciousness about the relevant stimulus and its properties. Okay, another implication is about the difference between perceptual uncertainty versus metacognitive uncertainty. Suppose you take a task like the one I described and you ask a subject to say whether it's tilted leftward or rightward. And then you ask the subject, okay, how confident are you in that decision? One view is that if you thought the consciousness gave them some kind of point estimate, then you might think that their report of confidence has to be something more sophisticated, some reflection upon their own conscious perception and how reliable it was that gives them that confidence rating. But another possibility, if conscious uncertainty is true, is that they're just reporting something not higher order, not something reflective, but something about the conscious perception itself, its own uncertainty. So there's no reflection, there's no metacognition involved in the report of confidence. Instead, they're simply reporting a fact, a further feature of their conscious perception that hasn't already been studied or hasn't already been measured by the experiment. So there's a real danger that lots of experiments that purport to be about metacognition are in fact just about the uncertainties that are inherent to the conscious perceptions themselves. So that's something else to keep in mind. A final potential implication is about the neural correlates of consciousness. Suppose that I'm right and that consciousness itself can involve representations of multiple possibilities and they are assigned degrees of uncertainty. Then in our search for the neural correlates of consciousness, we need to find regions of the brain that are capable of doing that. So if you find a region of the brain that's too unsophisticated or not able to represent uncertainties over possibilities, then you know you have not found the neural correlate of consciousness. So this might push our look for the neural correlate of consciousness to parts of the brain you might not otherwise have expected, those that are capable of more maybe accumulation of evidence and a more sophisticated representation of uncertainties, or other kinds of circuits that are more sophisticated than the ones we might have been looking for to begin with. So that potentially narrows our search for the neural correlates of consciousness. So I think this is a big topic, and I've tried just to summarize sort of the basic points. I'd be happy to talk to people. I'll certainly be happy to talk about it in Q&A, or happy to talk to you about it later, or shoot me an email if it's a topic that interests you. I think it has a lot of implications that are worth exploring, and I've only explored a few of them. So thanks very much.
We have time for questions?
Do you mind calling the questions for me?
Sure.
Okay.
Rafi.
Very interesting. I'm trying to understand better what you are saying. So obviously when I'm experiencing something, there might be uncertainty on mapping it onto a category. Your friend Isaac is a good example. I could see a blurry picture, and there is some uncertainty whether this is Isaac or not. But the experience itself of this blurred image is, to me, is a single certain experience. Whether I'll be able to successfully map it onto Isaac or not, that is uncertain. But the experience itself, are you arguing that I'm not even sure whether I see the blurred image that might be Isaac?
So some people think that in perceptual consciousness there's already categorization. So those people are going to respond to the Isaac case in thinking that there is uncertainty there in the perception itself. Other people might think that I think this is wrong, but other people might think that all categorization happens after the conscious perception. So one of the reasons I list so many examples is to provide other kinds of examples. So when you see something in the distance, an object in the distance, the trail marker in the distance, there's uncertainty about its color. It's not the case that there's some blurred...
Mapping it into a category of a color.
Exactly.
But the experience itself might be a mixture that is not easy to map to a color.
So what is the color in the experience itself?
None of your examples do not map on a category. They are all based on being uncertain in mapping it on some kind of a category.
So I don't think that's true. So a lot of them have to do with estimations. So that has to do with, say, the angle at which you've turned, or it has to do with the strength of a light. So those aren't categories. But even if you think that, so even so, you should think that conscious perception, in a way, has a phenomenological unity. I'm not saying there's many different phenomenal states. I'm talking about what's represented by the conscious perception. And so its estimates are going to... Okay. Got it.
I'm just gonna, really push on the same thing. So what is the uncertainty of a black room? I'm just looking at nothing. What is my uncertainty estimate there?
There might be no possibilities that are represented, and so there might not be no uncertainties distributed over them. At the level of belief, you might have a lot of uncertainty. Is this a living room, a dining room, or a kitchen?
No, I'm not.
But at the level of perception,
of all the space of not possibilities. I'm in a room, dark room with no sound. It's just black, but I'm having an experience of actually being there, very intense. So what in your account? How do I, I'm going to try to put it very bluntly, because it's where, like Rafi was kind of pushing you, right? There's no categories there, and it's just very definite. So
we have to distinguish two things: the phenomenal character of a perception and what the perception represents. So the experience you describe has a very definite phenomenal character, okay? But it doesn't have a very definite what it represents. So the view I have, I didn't go into this part of it, this is another part of the view, is that these experiences have definite phenomenal characters that are distinct from, say, that other experiences, but that what the uncertainty is at the level of what they represent. And I think the mistake lots of people make is that they assume that having a definite phenomenal character means there has to be a definite possibility that's represented, and there's no room for assignments of uncertainty.
But wouldn't that then be post-perceptual? Because what we worried is about the phenomenal character, right? So that's what we usually worry about.
So many people think that perception has two elements, that has a phenomenal character and it has representational element to it. And this is a claim about the representational element of it. So I don't know who the we is in that claim, but when we think about consciousness, when we think about conscious perception, we should think about more than just a feeling. We should think about representations of the world as being a certain way. And the claim is that to characterize, when we think about this, to properly characterize the phenomenal character of these perceptions, you can't just describe the representation of one way the world could be. You have to talk about many ways the world could be, which are then weighted by uncertainties. So maybe that's a more helpful way to think. Think about the representations as explaining or corresponding to the phenomenal characters this way.
So given your answer, I'm not sure you would disagree with me, but just proposing a simple experiment. Supposing that I represent uncertainty in my actual phenomenal experience, I should be unable to draw a picture of your friend Isaac from a distance, right? Because there isn't a single picture, there isn't a single point estimate that represents your friend Isaac from a distance. However, I would suppose that given some talented drawing, I would be able to draw that, and so would you. So
in the Isaac case, you can get around it by just drawing the features, like the color and the shape. But let's focus on another kind of case. Suppose there's an object in the distance, and there's uncertainty about its color. And then you're stuck, how am I going to paint that on, how am I going to draw that? And I actually claim there's a respect in which all paintings, all photographs are distortions of our actual phenomenology, precisely because they impose determinacy on the colors of objects and shapes an object in the distance that doesn't really exist within our own conscious perception.
So that means I should be able to look at this super realistic image and look at my experience and say, no, I'm experiencing something different here.
That's exactly right. I think that's true.
That seems like a simple experiment.
Well, it's not even an experiment. We could just take a snapshot and look at the scene in front of you. And, I mean, certainly we have to rely on introspection here, but mine is that they do not perfectly match.
According to my experience, certainty and consciousness can be doubly dissociated. So you can see something consciously and be unsure about it, uncertain, and you can see something unconsciously, subliminally, and nevertheless be sure about your answer. Because they are habitually intuitive decision makers who are used to base their decisions on their gut, and they can be completely sure about their responses. So the two dimensions are doubly dissociated.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So if I think if you asked most people, they would say that if you drew a kind of graph, there's one box that can't be filled, and that's the one with uncertainty and consciousness. And so you're exactly right. One implication of the view is that all of the boxes are live options. Uncertainty and consciousness can double dissociate.
Thank you. I was wondering what you make of a rivalry situation or ambiguity situation. I think there's tons of evidence that at the conscious level we cannot entertain multiple interpretations anymore, and we sample. There is a beautiful paper by Alex Pouget, also Moreno both, showing that we seem to sample from the distribution of possibilities, but we are unable to track them all. The same for garden path sentences, for instance, which are ambiguous, and whenever there is ambiguity, basically.
I think that's absolutely true. So the view is not that whenever there's a representation of uncertainty, that can be elevated into consciousness. There are some mechanisms that seem to involve collapse. So binocular rivalries are a good example. You see the house, you see the face, but you don't entertain uncertainties about them at once. And then there are other cases where it seems you do consciously entertain uncertainties about several possibilities. So one interesting project, for me at least, is to see what neurally distinguishes these two kinds of cases. Why in the case of colors of objects in the distance, or orientations of things that are of low contrast, do we seem capable of entertaining conflicting propositions, whereas in the case of binocular rivalry, it seems the mechanisms in the brain always lead to a collapse in those uncertainty representations. So I think you're pointing to a real phenomena that ultimately needs a neural explanation. But I don't think it shows the general point that there can't be representations of uncertainty in consciousness.
We have time for one more question.
I'm going to take up on Rafi's question again because the answer did not set my mind.
Okay.
I might have a very definite blurred representation that can have many interpretations. So in terms of what I experience, it is one thing. And if, for instance, I was asked to say whether it's short or tall, for that I might have the information. And then for this classification, I might have no uncertainty at all. But then this blurred image could be John, Shlomo, or whatever, the Isaac, because they're all this ambiguous figure, which is very definite, which is one percept, can match different classifications, which are post-perceptual or post-phenomenal. So I'm not sure.
In some cases, when you look at a blurred image, perceptually you don't get any particular identity, and there's some kind of reflective act where you have to try to match it with, say, a stored representation of Shlomo or Isaac or somebody else. But there are other cases when the identification seems to be in the perception itself.
Because of expectations.
Perhaps. So one.
Yeah, but then it's not. It's the image plus the added activation from a memory representation that gives some image that is more similar to Isaac. And then when it's going to get closer, this activation is going to disappear because there's a mismatch. So the point I'm trying to make here is that your phenomenal experience is one or the other, and it might fluctuate with the kind of information you're going to add to it, which might be expectations or anything that's not strictly perceptual but is going to affect your phenomenon.
So I'm inclined to think that these kinds of expectations can filter down into the conscious awareness itself. So the expectation that it's Isaac, or then you look at the blurry image, might lead you to actually consciously perceive. And that's not through some further post-conscious reflection. That's part of the conscious perception itself.
But it's not probabilistic. That's what I'm trying to say.
It's
you
not
have one phenomenology of perceptual.
Okay. Sorry. I'm just going to say there's probably coffee downstairs. You're approaching it. Pretty sure you're going to find it there. Thank you again for your time. We have a 30-minute.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.